episode. I'm Nico, this is Patty, and today we have the pleasure of having with us Professor Lichtenberg from the Georgetown University Philosophy Department and our former professor of political and social thought. Thank you for being with us, and today we will discuss the topic of criminal justice and criminal law with regards to morality.
So, first off, to start off the conversation, why don't you give us a brief introduction into your work with criminal law, criminal justice, and why you're interested in it?
Well, I've been teaching philosophy of law for a long time and also just general ethics courses, and one of the big questions that arises has to do with crime and punishment. Punishment is a subject that has always interested philosophers. Like, what are the justifications for punishment? I mean, punishment, we could say by definition, involves inflicting, as they sometimes say, hard treatment on people. It involves inflicting pain on people, and so you might think, well, that's a bad thing, usually. What could justify it? Yet most of us think that punishment in certain circumstances is justified, and so the question is why, and of course there are a variety of reasons we can talk about why punishment might be justified. But so that's the kind of philosophical, theoretical reason I'm interested in punishment. But it's just criminal law and criminal punishment is a big topic in the philosophy of law, and it's also a big topic in public policy. The United States incarcerates more people at a higher rate than any other country. 2.2 million people are currently in prison in the United States. There's also, a racial aspect. African Americans are disproportionately in prison to a point that it's extremely harmful to their communities. And we not only punish more often and for longer periods, but we punish more harshly than almost any other country with the death penalty, where the U.S. is almost the only industrialized country to still have the death penalty. And of course the death penalty receives a lot of attention, although it only affects a tiny number of prisoners, which isn't to say it's not a serious matter. I mean, if you're one of those prisoners, it's very, very serious. But leaving that aside, this is, fewer than 100 prisoners a year these days, I think. There are many other very, very harsh punishments in our system. So people who oppose the death penalty, for example, usually offer life without parole as an alternative. As if, life without parole, well, that's a piece of cake,
Sometimes. So you've already gone into some of the issues that pertain to criminal law, but can you explain some of the basic principles? How far can we go in justifying the punishment of a criminal? Can we go as far as the death penalty, as that life without parole? What are the moral stipulations of that?
So you have to think about what the possible justifications for punishment are generally, and people usually, I think they can be divided into four kinds. Or one of them can be divided into two, and then there are two others. So first of all, there's deterrence, the idea that you punish people in order to prevent future crime. And deterrence generally divides into two halves, what's called general deterrence and specific deterrence. So general deterrence is trying to deter other people from committing the crime. So you punish person X for committing a murder to make an example of him, so that other people will see, oh, if I commit this crime, this will happen to me, and this is supposed to deter other people from so acting. But the other justification for punishment is what's generally called by philosophers retribution. The idea that you punish someone because they deserve it, because they did this bad thing, and they ought to suffer for what they've done. And to some people this seems exactly right, and they want to say, yes, if you've done done something bad, you ought to suffer, you deserve to suffer. It's not a matter of bringing about any of these other kinds of benefits to society. You just ought to suffer. It's what you deserve. Some people find that satisfying and persuasive. To other people it sounds vindictive, and what's the point of inflicting more pain?
And almost archaic in a way.
Come up with an idea that retribution doesn't mean an eye for an eye. It means that there's a kind of, has to be a proportion between what you've done and what is done to you. The trouble with these forward-looking arguments like deterrence, general deterrence, for example, suppose it worked to, suppose if you gave people life imprisonment for stealing $100, that actually brought down the crime rate significantly. People were sufficiently scared that they were deterred. Would that be reasonable or just? We might think it wouldn't be just, because the punishment is just out of proportion to the crime. But these completely forward-looking justifications like deterrence don't really explain how that could be. It seems like, look, if it works, let's do it. So retribution has this odd character of, on the one hand, sounding harsh, but on the other hand, as a principle of desert, setting limits on how much you can punish people.
You can have degrees, and it's very interesting.
Yeah, and I mean, I think this concept is very interesting because I think that it's highly political and social in the sense that many people see this also as a state intervention versus freedom issue. I mean, two arguments that I often hear since I arrived in the U.S. and so most of the discussions are based on how much the state should intervene in life is, on one side, the more social democratic, or if you will, to the left argument against the death penalty that I heard is, oh, it's a political failure because it means that the state and society failed in recycling the dignity, if that even makes sense, in sort of giving someone the second chance to start a new life.
Mm-hmm.
And that's how some people I saw it. While on the other side, the more anti-paternalistic, if anything, libertarian vision that I saw was, this is too much, it's paternalistic, it goes into our individual freedom.
Why is it paternalistic?
It is not for the state to enter our lives and determine the fates to that extent, to end our life or to condition our life in the long term.
But
what is sort of your argument for opposing that penalty? I mean, if I may ask.
Yeah. Well, here, I think you can make a variety of different kinds of arguments. The one that's become most popular lately, and I would say only in maybe the last, well, I don't know, maybe it goes back longer than I'm thinking, because the Supreme Court struck down the death penalty in 1972. Not the whole thing, but they struck down all existing death penalty statutes on the grounds that they were racially biased and arbitrary. And then new statutes were drafted by different states, and these cases were tested again, and the Supreme Court upheld the death penalty in 1976. So there was a period when there were no death executions carried out. But then when these new statutes were fashioned to avoid these problems of racial bias and arbitrariness, which is a separate issue, arbitrariness just meaning that there was no rhyme or reason why some people got it and some people didn't. The racial bias was a different problem. Is not even so much the race of the defendant that is correlated with the death penalty, but the race of the victim. So the person most likely to be executed is the black killer of a white person. Black on black crimes are not nearly
It's controversial.
right, and death penalty is much less common. White on white, white on black, also less common, but it's black on white. But even though there have been attempts to fix this problem, there are still enormous racial disparities throughout the criminal justice system. And of course, one argument is, well, if they're throughout the criminal justice system, don't you have to abolish the whole, if you're going to argue that we shouldn't have the death penalty because it's racially biased, then should we say we should abolish the whole criminal justice system because it's racially biased? I mean, my feeling about that is, of course, it's not plausible to abolish the whole criminal justice system, but it is plausible. We don't need a death penalty, as many people have pointed out, contrary to what might seem to be common sense. It's more expensive to execute someone than to keep them locked up for their whole life. So you can't make the argument that it's cheaper. You also can't make the argument that it's a deterrent, because although there are people who would dispute this. I mean, most of the evidence shows that the death penalty doesn't deter others any better than lesser punishments. And
no, it's really interesting. Here we're looking a lot at the effects of a crime, or all about, so a person should be punished because of the severity of what they did. So someone killed somebody, so the retributionist principle would be that they have to be punished. But what about intent? How does, especially if we're talking about someone who's mentally ill or has some kind of mental stress, how would intent figure into figuring out how to punish somebody, and to what extent would we punish that person?
Well, typically, if you are charged with, say, first-degree murder, and we don't need to get into the details of the different degrees, but the highest, the most serious charge, first-degree murder, the idea is that you have to have mens rea, which means guilty mind, and you have to show that the person intended, premeditated the crime. I mean, there are lots of technicalities here in the meaning of intent and premeditation. I mean, premeditation doesn't mean you have to have been planning it for a very long time. It's very, very complicated. But at the very least, if you can show that someone didn't possess certain mental qualities which enabled them to know what they were doing was right, was wrong, to control their actions, then they have, that those are mitigating circumstances, or in the extreme case, a complete excuse. So, for example, the guy who tried to assassinate President Reagan in 1981, John Hinckley, who was obsessed with Jodie Foster and the movie Taxi Driver, and he was found to be legally insane, and therefore not guilty. So not guilty by reason of insanity. At the sentencing phase, there are, and I think this came as a result of the change in law when the death penalty statutes were reinstated. What are called aggravating circumstances and mitigating circumstances. So you would, if you kill more than one person, or you kill with particular cruelty, that could be an aggravating circumstance. Mitigating circumstance would be, having suffered abuse yourself, or various other conditions. It does seem to me and to many people that these kinds of circumstances are relevant and should be taken into account in sentencing people. And then again, there's just also the question of how much of a retributivist you are. And as I said earlier, it seems like it's very hard to let go of that idea altogether, because with it goes free will and a lot of other things. But on the other hand, some of us might want to pay more attention to the possibility of redemption and change than others.
Well, thank you very much. Yes, as always, we end up coming out with more questions at the end than at the beginning.
Yeah.
I think it's
the nature of philosophy. I think
yes,
it's
sort of
such
eternal disappointment, but it's good to keep looking. And well, I think that at this point, we want to thank you. Thank you very much for.
Thank you.
for-
This was fun.
No, thank you very much for coming on, Gyges, and we hope to have you again in the future. And
Definitely.
yeah.
And we'll post some, if you're interested more in this, we'll post some further reading recommended by Professor Lichtenberg here on our